All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We've been doing a lot of Bible decodes, New Testament decodes primarily over the last few months, and we've been focusing on this book called Christianity's Origins, Flavian Secrecy Cult by Michael Menescats. We just finished that book, and so today we're going to just do a little bit of an interlude and kind of comment about where we're headed. We're going to stick with a lot of these Bible themes, particularly, going with this Roman origins hypothesis, that it was the Romans in a psychological operation who wrote the New Testament, and it was particularly the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty, that is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, from 69 to 96 AD. And many authors have been going down this road over the last 25 years, 50 years, really even 150 years. Including Bruno Bauer, Sir Ronald Syme, James Valentine Hannay, Roman Piso, Abelard Reuchlin, Joseph Atwill, especially his book Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, Henry Davis, James Valiant, Cliff Carrington, and now Michael Menescats. And according to the theory, the Flavian dynasty wrote the Gospels and set it back by 40 years, put it back into the 30s AD, and there certainly is some information in there that points to a later period of it having been written, including the but this was the time that the Gospels are said to have been written anyway, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s AD, particularly Mark, Matthew, and Luke, in that order. John may have come later, even though some people like Barbara Thiering said that John was written as early as in the 30s AD. Using a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls as material, source material. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, I haven't read all of them, but or even many of them. But they can take you on a trip, because they talk about, this teacher of righteousness, and then the liar, and then the wicked priest. And so people are all trying to figure out, okay, which one is Jesus? Which one is Paul? Is Paul the wicked priest, or is he the liar? Which one, who is who? Is Caiaphas the wicked priest? Or is, it might not be referring to any of them, so you can start extrapolating like crazy once you get into reading the Dead Sea Scrolls and then trying to reconcile them with the Gospels. I personally think that the Romans probably did have access to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they used them as kind of a springboard to write the Gospels. And like in a crazy idea, I think the Romans had some kind of an elite contest. Everybody write a copy of everybody write a gospel. You got to tell a story about this guy named Jesus and talk about his exploits, and you got to include virgin birth. You got to include the episode when you're 12 that you get lost in Jerusalem, but you're found in the church. And then you gotta put it in this, you gotta put in that, you gotta have the Last Supper, you gotta have the crucifixion, and so on. And then they had all these entries, and they took the top four, or they took the top four and then took the rest of them and threw them in a cave, and to be discovered at a later period, something like that. But anyway, the point that I was making is that there are many authors who have now been, giving us their version of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament, and it was written, according to most scholars, at about the same time that the Flavian dynasty was going on. So either whether it's the Gospels, whether it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or whether it's the Romans, it was written in the 70s or 80s or 90s AD, and then it was backdated to the 30s. And for the Romans, they also, in addition to writing the Gospels, they wrote history of the war between the Romans and the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. And this was a war where the protagonists are the Roman Caesars, Titus and Vespasian, his father. They were the two leading generals in this war for the Romans. And so then they wrote this history called War of the Jews under the name of Flavius Josephus. And Flavius Josephus was a Flavian, a member of the Roman royal court of the Flavian court. He has a backstory that is outlandish and unbelievable, which makes me think that maybe Josephus never really existed, and that he was just a pen name of maybe a larger group, or maybe just a family, the Piso family, or maybe just whoever, one person, who wrote as Josephus and wrote this history. And then the history of War of the Jews and the Gospels are meant to be read together. They are companion pieces that kind of bounce off each other. They converse with each other. They mock each other, parody each other, and parallel each other. Written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. And so that's where you get the Roman origins hypothesis. If we know that Josephus emanates from the court of Rome, so with that connection, then we also know that the Gospels emanated from that same place, because the amount of parallels between the two are overwhelming when considered carefully, when you look carefully for them, and that's what Menescots did. But before that, Joseph Atwill did that in the early 20th century with Caesar's Messiah, and he found over 40 separate events from the military campaign of Titus in this War of the Jews in Josephus, and that Jesus' ministry in Judea is a mirror of Titus's military campaign in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus goes, in the same order. Over 40 events happening in the same order in the book of Luke and in War of the Jews. And every event or episode that Titus encounters, Jesus also encounters, but it's a conceptually parallel event, not an identical event, but the same type of event. And the events are all separated by 40 years, sometimes to the hour. And so that was one of Atwill's major contributions, although there are a long list of those. Menescats goes further into the book of Luke and digs out over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. That's over 10 per chapter. That is over 1 per every 5 verses. And some of the parallels last for several verses, basically meaning that the book of Luke is literally saturated with the parallels from War of the Jews. And so I think that's where we're going to be headed next on this channel. Maybe not right away, but eventually we're going to kind of turn Menescats' work upside down and look at it directly from the book of Luke. We're just going to go through the book of Luke and we're going to decode it from Josephus, but then from many other sources as well. And so we're going to show just how many verses in Luke have hidden meanings, have different meanings that we're not expecting. And we'll see how that goes. I might even do those live, but I'm trying to think about that. Now, the other thing that Menescats found that was overwhelming is that he graphed all 250 plus parallels on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. Every place he found a correspondence, he plotted a point. After plotting all 250 plus points, he formed 5 near-perfect letters in Latin. And we know Latin is the language of the Roman Caesars. Greek was also the language of the Roman Caesars, but more of a commoner's language. The New Testament is written in Greek, as is Josephus, the copy of Josephus that has come down to us at least. Josephus does refer to another version that was written in the father tongue, which scholars claim would be Chaldee. Although Menescats, I think, convincingly argues that the father would, in this case, be Vespasian. Father Vespasian, son Titus, and then maybe the Holy Ghost Domitian. So those 5 Latin letters are APTVS. The VS would be Vespasian, the T would be Titus, and the AP could be Aegeon Pneuma, which would mean Holy Spirit, or it could be Aries Piso or Aries Piso. That's what Menescats argues. I don't really know, but I believe that the main point is that the Romans literally signed their name to the book of Luke. They wrote it and they signed their name to it so that someday it would be discovered that they wrote it. And I bet you they're shocked nowadays to recognize that it took us almost 2,000 years to figure this out. Now, it really didn't take that long. Many authors and many other people most likely have decoded this over the years, but they might have been drawn and quartered or burnt at the stake or, given the old witch treatment or whatever in more barbaric times. In these days, they probably were just ignored. But in addition to all those historians from the last 150 years that I mentioned, according to Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso, innumerable authors of the past who mostly probably have one of the Pisos or the Flavians in their family tree recognized clearly that, or Pharisaic Jews, the Jews who wrote the Talmud, which was also a Flavian thing. The Flavians set up the campus for the Pharisaic Jews after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Vespasian set up a place for them to more or less divert the Judaism of the Pharisaic Judaism into really focusing on the text and deciphering the texts of the Torah and the other writings of the Old Testament, which didn't really exist at that time, but just the writings, including the Torah. But the Pharisaic Jews who wrote the Talmud were literally eyewitnesses of the creation of Christianity by the Romans. And so there's a lot of information in the Talmud about the origins of Jesus, but there also are, that story was passed down over the centuries. And perhaps that is how Amelia Bassano found out about it. She was a Sephardic Jew who lived in Italy until her family moved. They all moved to London to become the court musicians for Henry VIII in the mid-16th century. And according to Joseph Atwill, Amelia Bassano became William Shakespeare. And every last one of William Shakespeare's plays is about the fact that the Romans wrote the New Testament. And it is all deployed as a counterattack. Bassano saw that the New Testament was an attack of the Romans to the Jews, and that's really what it was. It was a pruning or a domestication of the Jews, but it was also a replacement of this lineage that the Jews had of so and so begat so and so begat so and so, and there's a historical lineage there. Vespasian and particularly Titus superimposed themselves at the end of the lineage, and so they pretty much completely through War of the Jews and the Gospels, they superimpose themselves. Because if you read War of the Jews, you'll see that all of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled in the pages of the War of the Jews. And most of them are fulfilled by Titus, which makes Titus the second coming of Jesus. And so Jesus is the end of this long line of, 42 generations or something, going all the way back to Adam, even though he was of a virgin birth. And in the two Gospels, I think it's Luke and Matthew, but I'm not sure, the two Gospels that mention the genealogy of Jesus are also the two Gospels that talk about the virgin birth. So which is it? If it's a virgin birth, then he's not the son of Joseph, son of Heli, or whatever, going all the way back. But, that's easy to rationalize away, I guess. But then you go to Jesus, and then the next one is Titus, because Titus is the second coming of Jesus. And so the Romans literally placed themselves on the detour of Judaism. And Amelia Bassano saw that as an attack, which it is. And so she wrote all the plays of Shakespeare and the sonnets as a counterattack, where the Jews are basically trying to domesticate, tame, and prune the Gentiles, or in the Romans. So Joseph, now I've only read a couple of the Shakespeare plays, but Joseph Atwill says that if you read it with that in mind, if you know that that's what's going on, it makes decipherable all of those indecipherable lines from Shakespeare. I mean, even the experts on Shakespeare are like, well, I only understand like 70% of it. There's 30% of it that's just, an enigma. But Atwill says that he was able to decode just about every line of all of the Shakespeare plays. But it's not just Shakespeare. It also includes Emerson and Tolstoy and Cervantes, Mary Shelley. Apparently, Frankenstein's monster is 100% about the creation of Jesus. Byron and Fielding and Poe and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and quite a few other pseudo-Christian authors who pretend to be Christian but actually know what the real story is. But according to Abelard Reuchlin, all of these authors knew really did know who wrote the New Testament, and they all wrote about it, but in code. That's going to be another step for me in the future, is to kind of, I'm not much of a novel reader. I've read a few of the works that are described. When I was in 8th grade, we had a class at the school that I went to that was just called Tolkien. That's all we read for the whole year. But I think all we read was The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. That was in 8th grade, so I'd have to read those over again. But I'd like to, I think one place I might start would be Christopher Marlowe. He was apparently possibly a lover of Amelia Bassano. She was nominally married to this guy, Lord Hunsdon, and then he kind of put her away, and then she got married to this guy, Lanier. But I think before Christopher Marlowe was murdered, they both knew what the score was, and that, I believe that is why Christopher Marlowe was murdered. There is a book out there that's just called The Death of Christopher Marlowe. I've only gotten through about the first half of it, though. Anyway, so that's probably about where we're going. The next couple days, I might be talking about various aspects. What I'd like to do is go over this book by Lee Strobel called The Case for Christ. And in it, it's a pretty well-known book among Christian apologists. And he has about 30 other books that are all in the same vein, like the case for the resurrection, the case for the virgin birth, the case, but he was a legal reporter for like the Chicago Tribune, and so he sets up his books like he's making a legal case for the existence of Jesus and the historical Jesus, and he goes around the country and interviews all kinds of expert Christian apologists, scholars, and they about various aspects of the whole gospel story. And Now, I've only read The Case for Christ. I haven't read all of his other books. But in The Case for Christ, it's amazing that the arguments he makes, I think there's like 15 chapters, and the arguments he makes that make the case for Christ, they make the case for Caesar way better than they make the case for Christ. They are, because he resorts to Occam's razor all the time. He's like, well, there is no really good explanation for why this happened, so God did it. And he's ignorant of the Roman origins hypothesis. If you plug in the Roman origins hypothesis, everything fits into place, and there's no need to resort to God did it at all. The Romans could have done it much more easily than God did it, at least according to William of Ockham. And so I'm going to try to go over some of the highlights of that book. I don't want to read the whole thing or anything, but just go over some of the highlights. And I might try to introduce some of the work of Roman Piso as well. He's got like 150 articles out there. A lot of them are genealogical, but and quite a few of them, I don't really agree with, but he does a great job of really playing the name game, going over with a fine-tooth comb all the articles from Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, and some of the Pisos, and trying to figure out who is who, what alias names are being used by whom. And by doing so, he was able to independently figure out that the New Testament was written by Roman Piso and his family. Now, Roman Piso was basically one of the shadow emperors under the Flavians, and a very close relative to Titus and Vespasian. And he wrote them, and independently of Abelard Reuchlin, who came up with the exact same proposed author, Arius Piso, who's not really even known to history, because he is known under 30 or some different pseudonyms and does not really appear in the historical record. But both of them independently determined that Roman Piso was the author. I mean, not Roman Piso, Arius Piso. Arius Calpurnius Piso. And I find that pretty compelling. Menescot's goes into it, but I get the feeling that Menescot's hasn't read, he's read some of Roman Piso's articles, but probably hasn't read more than a dozen of them or something. And he has, 150, 175 of them. Some of them are short, but some of them are book length, and so it's more than a job. And it's very tedious to read it also, because he goes over the same information over and over again, which is totally understandable, because each article has to stand on its own. But there could be a more economical way of putting together his material. So I'm trying to work on that, trying to organize to do the Book of Luke straight up with the decodes, not only from War of the Jews, but from many other sources as well. Because, just because you're using the Roman origins hypothesis doesn't mean that you can't decode the Bible also according to mythology, like the precession of the equinoxes and the movement of the sun through the houses of the zodiac, and through the lens of mythology and all of the Egyptian and Greek mythology that the Gospels are borrowing, along with the epics of Homer, and also using the Dead Sea Scrolls as a lens for decoding. So there's a lot of different approaches that can be taken to understand the scriptures on a deeper level, and not just the Roman origins hypothesis. So that's kind of what I'm going to make, what I'm going to be working on this channel, hopefully starting pretty soon. But we might be taking a little bit of an interlude for a few days, going over that Listro Bell and maybe some Roman Piso and possibly a few other things before we get back around to the book of Luke. And then eventually we're going to get to the Old Testament. And we're going to see that basically there is no God in the Old Testament, or possibly there is a God that lasts until Genesis 1, and then on day 6 God takes a hiatus and is replaced by Yahweh Elohim, who is a God with a small g. He is a God who is more powerful than we are, has better technology, lives longer, has a much clearer idea of what the hell is going on, but at the very same time, he is a God that has incredible amount of weaknesses, including being jealous and zealous and having OCD and being a smoking addict of animal fat, and seems like he has quite a few other appetites, including for virgins. And all of this stuff is talked about in the Old Testament. Another thing that I find completely insulting about the Old Testament is that it's clearly a copy, and I knew this because I read the copy before I read the Old Testament. It's copied from much older stories, the Sumerian Enuma Elish creation story, and all of the whole Near East. Dozens of other stories also kind of come from that Sumerian base. So the Sumerian version of especially most of Genesis, or at least, the first 10 chapters of Genesis, are right from the Sumerian, but the scholars think that the Sumerian story